Yo, Alex here. In my review of the iQOO 12, I mentioned that their new design language seems to be indicative of the desire to change their direction and go from making just gaming-centric phones to making phones that are more well-rounded, and my experience with the phone seems to corroborate that, especially when it comes to camera performance. Well, it seems like with the iQOO 13, they're taking a step back in that direction and focusing a bit more on the gaming part again. Let's start with design. For the most part, it has the same design language as the iQOO 12, which I do like. I got the white version this time round, which looks really clean, but I just wish that they went with a matte frame instead of this shiny one. And while using the phone, I noticed that from time to time, there will be a bit of a clicking sound and sensation. This is most obvious for my unit when using the phone in landscape while gaming, and it's easily reproducible by just applying a small amount of twisting force on the phone. It's apparently a pretty common thing based on user feedback I've seen on Bilibili, and when some of them inquired about this, the response is that it's normal because a reasonable safety distance is reserved between the back cover and the battery to ensure the safety of the battery during charging or discharging. If this is normal, then it's a bit of a shame because this kinda makes the phone feel cheap. The camera bump now has some RGB lighting that you can use for some lighting effects for supported games and for certain types of alerts. I don't really care much about it and will not be using it. Another thing I'm not a huge fan of is how the phone is now noticeably heavier. I know that it does have a denser battery this time round, and there is a glass fiber back version that is a bit lighter, but still, I can't help but wonder if the phone could have been a bit lighter if they just removed the RGB lighting. Anyway, the front of the phone houses a 2K 144Hz 8T-LTPO 6.82-inch screen from BOE, which supposedly looks nicer and is also easier on the eyes with the use of circular polarization tech and high-frequency PWM dimming for all brightness. After spending some time with it, I think the screen is definitely a big step up from the screen used on the iQOO 12 in almost every aspect. Nicer colors, better viewing angles, higher resolution, and higher brightness. In terms of eye strain, I'm not sure if it's better or not since I only used the iQOO 12 for like a month before getting rid of it, but the screen on the iQOO 13 is not that great for me, especially since I'm now a lot more sensitive to PWM flickering than I used to be. It uses 2160Hz PWM dimming for all brightness out of the box, and while it's not as horrible as the Neo 9S Pro at higher brightness, there is still noticeable eye strain for me after using the phone for a short while. There is an option to turn off all brightness PWM dimming and use DC-like dimming for higher brightness, but my issue is that it only kicks in at a brightness level that is way higher than my preferred brightness indoors, which is where I spend most of my time. So for me, the only way to comfortably look at the screen is when I'm outdoors and using a higher brightness. There is an option to use the extra dim feature to lower the brightness of the phone to a level where the brightness is just barely acceptable for me, but I would also need to turn off auto brightness to make sure it doesn't dip too low and trigger PWM dimming again. Then there is another issue where going into a game would switch the dimming option back to PWM dimming again no matter the brightness level, which is a pain when I'm trying to play games outdoors. So yeah, this is a deal breaker for me. Your mileage may vary of course since PWM sensitivity and eye strain is something that will vary from person to person. I am probably on the more sensitive side, so you might be okay with it. The iQOO 13 got a nice upgrade to an ultrasonic fingerprint sensor. It's really fast to unlock, the position is way easier to reach, and it works even if my fingers are a little wet. The only downside is that it's a bit more picky about the thickness of screen protectors. Moving on to the highlight of the phone, performance. It's using the latest Snapdragon 8 Elite chipset, which based on initial reviews I've seen, seems to be a big step up from its predecessor. The iQOO 13 also has a dedicated gaming chip, which should help with managing gaming performance better, as well as providing better upscaling and frame interpolation performance. On top of all that, it's also using faster RAM and UFS storage compared to most other phones using the same chip. So it's no surprise that it really does perform quite well when it comes to gaming. I tested the usual games that I play, Genshin, Honkai Star Rail, Zenless Zone Zero, and Wuthering Waves, and at the highest graphic settings, it can still maintain mostly 55 to 60 FPS after 30 minutes of playtime without the phone heating up too much. Do note that I'm not intentionally running around the map and trying to push the chip hard by constantly loading the environment and whatnot. I'm playing those games normally and doing things that actual players will be doing. Dailies, farming for materials, doing some quests or events, clearing endgame content, and whatnot. And I'm also playing these games while the phone is in a case because I think that's what most people, including myself, will be doing. I don't think anyone will go through the hassle of removing their case every time they want to game on their phone. The phone also now supports USB 3.2 Gen 1 unlike the iQOO 12, and it is now possible to just connect the phone to a monitor and Bluetooth controller if you want to game on a larger display. Connecting a phone to a larger display for gaming isn't anything new of course, but the experience when it comes to more intensive games wasn't that great in the past for even Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 devices, since they still use up quite a bit of power and will heat up more. With how good the latest generations of chips are, it's finally something that is feasible, especially since a lot of the newer phones support resolution upscaling as well. I can't really test the upscaling part on this iQOO 13 since it seems like only Genshin is supported on Origin OS, and well, Genshin has no controller support on Android, so there's no point plugging the phone into a larger display. But for other games like Zenless Zone Zero, Wuthering Waves, and Honkai Star Rail, even at their usual resolution, the gaming experience on a 24-inch monitor is still excellent. Even with higher graphics and with the charger plugged in, a small fan blowing towards the back of the phone is all it takes to keep the phone cool. It didn't even feel warm to the touch after testing these games for over 30 minutes, and was running really smoothly. This is really impressive to me because needing to mirror the display usually takes up some processing power on the phone as well, so you would usually expect the phone to heat up more. At least I couldn't imagine any phones using the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 doing it, since even just gaming on the phone itself at high graphics would heat up the phone noticeably, even with a small fan. To be able to do this with ease really showcases how power efficient this chipset is. On top of all that, iQOO also added bypass charging feature, which is perfect for this use case. This will let the charger power the phone directly, thus avoiding the extra heat generated while charging the battery. Even though the iQOO 13 already runs quite cool with a small fan and doesn't need the extra help, being able to bypass the battery also helps reduces battery wear and tear, since it reduces the amount of charging cycles that the battery will need to go through. Seeing how well the phone performs in this scenario makes the lack of controller support for Genshin on Android even more annoying. Aside from just being able to game on a larger display, the game itself is just less enjoyable when it's being played on a touchscreen. It's a little funny when I think about how they've had more than a few collaborations with Android brands already, but still refuses to do the one thing that would make the game more enjoyable to play on mobile. Anyway, in terms of battery life, with the more power efficient chip and a much larger 6150 mAh battery this time round, battery life is pretty great too. The iQOO 12 was already good enough for me for a day of usage, but better battery life is always a good thing to me. I took note of the drop in battery percentage while playing a few games, and it's a pretty noticeable improvement over previous phones I've used. Still no wireless charging here, which personally isn't a deal breaker for me, but it still does support up to 120 watt charging, which is more than fast enough to quickly top up the phone if you need to. Best of all, you don't need to spend extra money to take advantage of this feature, since it comes with a charger in the box, and it's a pretty good quality charger as well. Software-wise, I went with the Chinese version this time round with Origin OS because, well, let's just say I'm not the biggest fan of FunTouch OS. This new version of Origin OS 5 is largely similar compared to Origin OS 4 on the Neo 9S Pro, just with nicer animations here and there, a few more useful features, and a bunch of AI stuff which I won't be talking about since it's not something I care about at all. It might look a little overwhelming at first with all the Chinese apps, but the majority of them, including a lot of Vivo's own apps, can be easily uninstalled in no time at all. This is way better than the global FunTouch OS, which is more restrictive and has useless apps that can't be uninstalled. I know because I used the global version iQOO 12, and it was super annoying, especially with them putting a Jovi button in the quick settings tab that can't be removed. Anyway, Origin OS 5 is really smooth, responsive, and really nice to use. I like how Chinese OS in general handles permissions and privacy controls. Origin OS's customization options are quite nice and useful, the UI design looks clean to me, and it has quite a few useful features. Not going to dive in too deep since this is something that is quite subjective, but just want to give a mention to this new custom brightness setting. It basically gives you a test to learn about your own preference for brightness level. I know Android is supposed to have adaptive brightness, which does something similar over time, but on some phones, it never quite worked that well for me. Some are better and some are worse, but none of them worked as well as on iPhones for some reason. I know the solution here isn't the most elegant, but it does seem to work quite well. After doing this, I almost never have to manually adjust the brightness. Anyway, being a China-only software, there are some things to take note of. Like with most other Chinese OS, while I can easily install Google Play Store from their App Store and enable basic Google services in settings, some stuff like Nearby Share and Google Location History wouldn't work. Android Auto and Android Wear too, if I'm not mistaken. And if you want immediate notifications, you'll need to change a few settings and lock the app in recent apps to make sure that they don't get put to sleep. Another thing is that being a China-only OS, it is possible that there might be unexpected bugs or compatibility issues here and there. I have a friend who has some issues using a work profile on his phone, and that was a deal breaker for him. Some of the gaming features like resolution upscaling or frame interpolation might not be available as well since they need to be whitelisted by the phone itself. For example, while the global version of Genshin finally got support for resolution upscaling, it still doesn't support frame interpolation, even though it is supported for the Chinese client for Genshin. So this is something that you'll have to try out for yourself to know for sure if the apps you need will all work properly or not, since everyone has a different set of apps they rely on. Oh, by the way, for folks watching this in Singapore, I've had no issues with the few banking apps I'm using, no issues using SingPass, and Google Pay works just fine too. Though I'm not sure about public transit since I don't use my phone for that. I mentioned at the start of this video about how iQOO is focusing a bit more on the gaming part again this time round, and since camera performance has nothing to do with gaming, this is where they've decided to cut some cost in order to keep the price of the phone lower. The ultra-wide-angle camera seems to be similar, but the main camera sensor is now a little smaller with smaller aperture as well, and the telephoto camera is now just a regular 2x camera instead of the 3x periscope telephoto camera we got on the iQOO 12. The first two actually doesn't feel like that big of a deal and still perform similarly, but the change in the telephoto camera makes quite a big difference. I don't really care that much about the range, but it's just that I really liked the telephoto macro feature. I can still use digital zoom of course, but the quality is just not the same. It's not something I can't live without, and for a gaming-centric phone, I don't think folks that are considering this phone will be losing any sleep over it. That said, there is still a pretty noticeable upgrade in terms of the front camera. It takes nicer selfies now, and it can shoot video up to 4K 60, which is better than the 1080p 30 on the iQOO 12. Rear video capture is more or less about the same and just okay looking. All in all, while it does seem like iQOO is focusing more on gaming this time round and taking a small step back in terms of camera performance, there are still quite a lot of nice improvements that I'm seeing this time round, especially for gaming. A nicer looking screen, a much larger battery, the latest processor with faster RAM and storage, UFS 3.2 Gen 1 with display out support, and the bypass charging feature. The last three in particular has enabled a new way for me to game using my phone, which is a big deal to me. I only play these few games, so it doesn't make sense for me to buy a gaming console, and I've been a Mac user for nearly 2 decades, so I'm not buying a PC just to game either. I don't really want to use third-party cloud gaming services, and I also vastly prefer Android over iOS. I know it's a very niche use case, but it's one that fits my needs really well and saves me money and space. I can quickly do the more mundane stuff like farming, dailies, and whatnot on the phone itself, and when there is a main story quest or when the mood strikes, I can plug the phone in and enjoy gaming on a larger screen. The only thing missing for me is controller support for Genshin on Android, but that one is on HoYoverse. On top of all that, it still has above average sounding stereo speakers, the haptics still feels good, and we're even getting an IP68+69 rating. Not forgetting about the ultrasonic fingerprint sensor too, which some flagship phones are still lacking. The phone did see some price hikes compared to the iQOO 12, but it is still cheaper than most of its competitors, and still a pretty decent deal if you're looking for a gaming-centric phone that can still do the regular stuff well enough. Personally though, the issue with that clicky body isn't something that's acceptable for me, not for a phone in 2024, and especially not for a phone in this price range. Then there is the screen, which just isn't suitable for my eyes. No matter how much I like its gaming capabilities and performance, I'm not going to torture my own eyes just for that. Just doing all these testing for this review was torture enough already. So because of these two deal breakers, the iQOO 13 is sadly not the phone for me. But if you're okay with all the things I've mentioned earlier, and you just want a great gaming experience on a phone that is still quite well-rounded and not crazy expensive, then yeah, the iQOO 13 could be an option.